Time for a celebration?
Not so fast, Davy. I'm afraid you still need to be punished.
Oh, but John.
Oh, John, do we have to?
Rules of the house, I'm afraid, Flo. Rules of the house. Drink up, there's a good lad.
Welcome back to Ephemeral Radio. That last piece was by Ed Humphrey and was called The Tenants. Now, in our studio class, we actually had a day where we dedicated ourselves to learning about radio and the history of radio. And we began to sort of look at the ways in which radio really served a purpose in history at one point, and it was honestly a main source, of course, for information, especially during wartime, and it was used as a means to entertain people, and that was through music, and of course, later on it was through radio plays. And nowadays, we use, I think, the means of television more than anything to have stories played out for us. And in some ways, radio plays are almost more effective, I think, in allowing us to imagine scenes and characters. And there's a certain richness that is lost, I think, when we get to see all of that in television. There's no room for our imagination in describing what maybe the scene would look like or what those characters are wearing. Even the looks that those characters would give each other in a moment of, confusion or dismay, that's all given to us in television. Whereas in radio, it allows us to really get involved in what's happening. Not to say that you can't get, emotionally involved in a film or a TV show or even the news for that matter. It's just that I think radio gives room for the imagination to be a little bit more involved. And I think that's specifically because not everything is just laid out for us. This makes me think too that Ed's piece is quite similar in a way to the last piece we listened to by Jordan, in a sense that things are left out. Things are left out so the viewer or the listener can piece the work together and to really sort of personalize that experience of listening to that work. Now, Ed has actually given me a couple references in regards to how his piece came about, and he said that his piece is inspired by Dennis Potter's Singing Detective, Harold Pinter, who is an English playwright, screenplay writer, and the old Harry Hill show. So I think out of those three references, I'm really intrigued by Harold Pinter particularly. Harold Pinter, as I mentioned, was a playwright, and I think he died about 2 years ago or so, around Christmas time. But anyway, he is most well known for his absurdist plays. Now, other famous playwrights that came out of that time would include playwrights like Samuel Beckett or Eugene Ionesco or even Fernando Arrabal. Anyway, for those of you who are not quite sure what that absurdist theater genre is, it basically refers to the belief that human existence has no meaning or purpose, and therefore sort of all communication breaks down. Now, when I think of the dialogue that sort of occurred within Ed's piece, I actually get a real sort of absurdist and surreal sense, and especially with those really excellent and really sort of wonderful sound effects that occur when, they're describing that moment when the policeman sort of falls unconscious or whatever. It's very absurd. It's absolutely absurd, and the ways in which the characters choose to, evaluate the scene and the interactions with the policeman. It's all very nonchalant. They don't seem to actually care, at all. And it almost sort of seems that this idea of, yes, serving tea is a repetitive action, and this kind of thing happens all the time, which definitely plays into the ideas of nonsense that absurdist theater is very much about. I think Ed's piece too, just in another light, really captures a sense of life and relationships between human beings. And no matter how absurd they sort of come off, perhaps, in that radio play, I think there's a real sense of evaluation and perception of one another. Now, looking at the actual history of radio plays, there's been a few in history that have really sort of stood out, and I think that's partly because of the reaction that the listeners had listening to the pieces, and also I think the pieces themselves maybe questioned larger social issues. I think one of the more well-known pieces would be War of the Worlds, which came out in 1938 and was directed by Orson Welles. Now, this radio play was actually a part of a series called The Mercury Theatre on the Air, and this episode was performed for Halloween of 1938. The first 2/3 of the 60-minute broadcast were presented as a series of simulated news bulletins, which suggested to many listeners that an actual alien invasion by Martians was currently in progress. Because the Mercury Theatre on the Air was actually a sustaining show, which means there was no commercial breaks, it actually gave the listeners, a sense of realism, and that perhaps these news broadcasts and, information about the Martians coming to Earth were actually accurate and were actually real. It was really hard for them to be able to decipher whether it was part of the show or whether it was an actual, interruption in the normal program. So when this happened, there was actually a bit of supposed panic that occurred in response to the broadcast, and it really brought to light how much radio could influence the people who were listening, and how important that information that the public could receive off of the air was to them, and this idea that the information they would be gathering is almost their only way of knowing what is actually happening at a global level. So I think those involved in radio broadcasting after the War of the Worlds was played, they became very cognizant of the effects perhaps that radio plays could have on the public. That idea that this story, although supposedly would be fictional, could have elements of realism to them, and that in a public spectrum, that information that broadcasting would be saying, the public could respond to it in a very real way. The reaction that's come out of War of the Worlds and other radio plays that played with that idea of fiction and real life has definitely inspired contemporary radio broadcasters, or even artists who are working in the audio field. One piece that we looked at as a class was actually created in 2011, and it was titled Romeo Echo Delta, and it was a sound project by Ian Forsyth and Jane Pollard, and was produced especially for And Festival. It was inspired by a long line of hoax alien invasions and fake UFO scares, but most importantly by Orson Welles' radio broadcasting War of the Worlds. So the work was broadcasted by BBC Radio Merseyside on the 31st of October 2011, and was actually accompanied by an ominous red light in the night sky above Birkenhead. Dense with speculation and confusion and repetition, the transmission began with the arrival of a studio guest, X Factor finalist Maria Lawson. So her interview was actually interrupted with the breaking news of this unexplained red light. So their piece was definitely plugging into that old age fascination with the red planet and the possibility of Earth invasion from another world. say that Forsyth and Pollard sort of aimed to maybe like unpick the nature of contemporary reporting, where breaking news stories were frequently caught in a suspended limbo before any real facts emerge. There are two versions of this work, actually, because version A that they made was rejected by the BBC editorial policy board. They deemed it was too realistic and, likely to induce panic in their listeners, which is, quite what happened when they had War of the Worlds play. So, following edits and re-recording, there was a version that came out that was produced and aired. And that one was deemed to be a little bit perhaps less realistic. So the history of radio plays and their extent to which they've influenced the public is quite rich, and I think it's probably going to continue to be, because obviously there is this fascination that we have with depicting fiction as reality, and radio works so well to convey that. And even if the stories, appear absurd or a little bit, out of this world, such as, Ed's piece, The Tenants, or, War of the Worlds, or Romeo Echo Delta, it at least allows the public's sense of reality and time to be suspended for a moment and imagine themselves in situations like that, or in the case of Romeo Echo Delta or War of the Worlds, question their own lives. Very powerful stuff, I think. Our next piece on ephemeral radio also looks at ways that we can perceive information. However, I think this piece is a lot more voyeuristic and fragmented. The next sound piece we have coming up for you today was created by artist and designer Chloe Henderson. Her piece is titled The Walk Home, and she describes it as this. Chloe lives in student accommodation with a dodgy heating system and is always incredibly warm, so her window is always wedged open. Her window looks out onto the busy Hawk Hill Road. One insomnia-riddled night, the inspiration for her sound piece floated in through the open window. The Walk Home is a composed collection taken from the recordings of the little snippets of conversations that Chloe hears as people pass her bedroom window. It's a beautiful glimpse into the stray thoughts of the average Dundonian as they stumble happily home from their nighttime adventures. This is Ephemeral Radio, and you're listening to The Walk Home by Chloe Henderson.
Scott! Where's Scott? She's past Jonas They held up the game pack for the Wii U, and everyone's like, I was walking fucking holes in it!
No, that should have been really good. I know, I swear, because I said it in the town. I think I'd rather trying out the things at one store and then the everybody. Waiting for you to get home and I took prize on you.
Splash, splash, I was taking her down.
Two geniuses of the athletics. So you want to learn athletics?
I want to do Well, they can't do shit that's field because that's field is shit. So even if they do shit, they fucking say, they lost to the don't fit. Fuck that. How much did you get into it with? 350. 350. Well, we for the class, I mean the class. Okay. Take that. How much? Oh, fuck off. How much did you? It's like fresh to the gun. Mine's like 9 months, everyone else is like 7. I did the course, but I didn't graduate from it. I got my money back because I told them that I'd been so back. They did get my money back.
That was The Walk Home by Chloe Henderson. Now, I found that piece to be quite intriguing, mostly because she has found a way to really fragment the series of audio clips. And it's very voyeuristic, there's this sense that she is just on the other side of that glass, and as the night progresses, she's hearing all of these little bits of conversation and dialogue and sounds. There's a real sense of timelessness presented in Chloe's work, and I think part of that is because I would say the majority of people have had an evening out with their friends, and that association with time and, the duration of that evening kind of escapes you in the moment. And although during an evening it may seem like time is non-existent and you're getting on with the people who you're spending time with, it's only until you're walking home or heading home at the end of the evening that you kind of realize time again, and there's a sense of reflection and gathering your thoughts, or lack of thoughts depending on how much alcohol you've had. I think Chloe's piece really captures that sense of dialogue that occurs among friends, or even those footsteps that are walking past her window. We get a sense of conclusion and a realization that, yes, the night is coming to an end. I think that awareness of time, too, is really reiterated by the subtle heartbeat that occurs in the last bit of that audio piece. I think like a clock, in a way, the heartbeat can really cause us to become aware of ourselves and aware of ourselves within time. It is, in a way, a measurement of a moment. I think, if you think about a heartbeat really speeding up or slowing down, or even that sort of palpitation, that is a perfectly adequate representation of time passing. What I think is really effective about using that heartbeat as well is the fact that Chloe has been listening to these people who are very separate from her in a social context, in an actual physical context. They're both existing in their own worlds at that moment. And yet, that simple recording of a heartbeat brings to light the idea that we are all connected and we all are existing within the same parameters of time. And that presence of a heart beating or a clock ticking reminds us that we exist and that our lives are just a series of moments that make up who we are. I think Chloe's piece too brought to light some of our ideas surrounding youth. And I feel like there is this idea of immortality that really ties itself to youth. And I know that I've spoken with, my grandparents and even my parents about this, but youth for them was very much this time of feeling invincible, and that the world is laid out in front of you and you have so much to live for and to experience. I think that the concept of youth is very idolized these days as well, and I think even within a broader context such as advertising and the ways in which we gather information, it's all directed to that sense of immortality and essence of youth being able to escape time. I'd be curious to know whether anyone who listened to that last piece felt sort of a pang of nostalgia for youth, or even a sadness knowing that those kind of evenings are quite specific, I think, to being in your 20s or even 30s. And once they're over, it's very hard to relive them. I think humans have a tendency to look for ways in which they can connect themselves to the past. And I think that's very much about finding ways to justify our existence and to be able to measure time in a more cohesive sense. I think, too, it's very much about holding on to moments when we felt more than anything like we belonged. All right, so next up here, we actually have an audio piece that I made. It's titled Christmas Past. And as I mentioned, I am an exchange student. I'm traveling over here for 4 months, and I'm from Canada originally. So being over here has got me really interested in my ancestry and my my heritage, and more importantly, I guess, my family roots here from Britain. So my piece, I guess, describes the relationship that I have with my past, and how the people in my past that I am connected to, although I've never met, have really sort of defined who I am today in one way or another. My piece is compiled by using actual reels that were sent over from Canada to England and back during the Christmas holidays between the 1950s to the 1970s. I'm very lucky to have these reels because they really are, sort of a key to the past. So I've used these reels in a way to describe just past experience and a sense of belonging, because I think for me, being over here, miles away from my home, I've really begun to question the idea of belonging. And for me, much of that comes from my family and my heritage. So once again, you're listening to Ephemeral Radio, and this is Christmas